going to talk about schedules of reinforcement a little bit more. These are time-based schedules, time-based. Previously we talked about response-based or response-dependent schedules. Now we're talking about a schedule of reinforcement that involves the passage of time and the presentation of that reinforcement. The first one that we're going to talk about is a fixed interval schedule. A fixed interval schedule. We talked about fixed schedules and we talked about fixed ratio, right? The same meaning in terms of fixed. Okay? The I stands for the interval, the amount of time. So what you have already learned applies to this example. We've got a fixed interval schedule. The duration of the interval never changes. Okay? So let's look at our definition here. So a reinforcer is contingent on the first response after a fixed interval of time since the last opportunity for reinforcement. So we have a period of time, let's say 10 seconds. The first response that occurs after 10 seconds will be reinforced. So it goes shorter, 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 shorter. 10 seconds has elapsed. The first response that occurs after 10 seconds will be reinforced. Fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. Here's our pattern of response or response pattern. We talked about this previously. All schedules produce a typical response pattern. And this is seen with a fixed interval schedule too. It's called an FI scallop. The fixed interval scallop. So responding at the beginning of the interval is very low or non-existent. Then as the interval starts to get to its end, as it gets closer to ending, the rate of responding gradually increases, and then we have a high rate of responding until the first response at the end of the interval is reinforced. And then there's a pause again. No responding, and so on. And you have this curve in the rate of response. Let's see a picture. There it is right there. In an FR schedule, it's square. It's 90 degrees. But here we've got that scallop, that curving. Because on an FI schedule, there's no responding at the beginning of the interval, then a gradual increase in the rate. And that's why you see that curve. We're going to look at a couple examples to help you discriminate a true FI schedule versus something that looks like an FI schedule. It's called an analog, something that looks like it's an approximation, but it's not a real true FI schedule. We'll find out why in just a moment. Okay? Whoops. Let's back up to our analysis here. We're going to put Rudy the rat in an operant chamber on an FI 2-minute schedule, just like what we looked at before. In that operant or that experimental chamber, there is no calendar, there is no clock for Rudy the rat that tells Rudy when to press the lever. There is no clock, there is no calendar. that tells Rudy the rat when to press the lever at the end of the interval. On a true FI schedule, there is no marker. There is no timing device signaling the organism when to respond. Okay? There is no deadline. In other words, get it done by this time or you lose the opportunity for the reinforcer. There is no deadline. So on a true FI schedule, it's the first response after the end of the interval that will be reinforced. So Rudy the rat could wait 2 weeks before he makes the first response after the end of the interval. And that behavior would still be reinforced. There is no deadline. Let's look at a non-example here. A paycheck. I get paid every 2 weeks. Does that sound like a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement? Sounds like it. But a fixed interval schedule is where the first response after the end of the interval is reinforced. Do I need to make a response to get that paycheck? Nope. It just appears. So even though it looks like a FI schedule, it's not. Because I don't have to make a response after the end of the interval. Let's say if I get paid once a month. At the end of the month, do I need to make some response at the end of the month to get the money? Yes.
But you still have to respond to get that.
But I have to do something.
Yeah.
But do I have to make a response after 30 days to pick up my paycheck? No. Then it's not an FI schedule. It sort of looks like it, but it's not. Because on a true FI schedule, it's the first response after the end of the interval that will be reinforced. Yes?
Does it matter the response?
Absolutely. The response has got to be the correct response. Okay? If we had a rat in a chamber, it would be a lever press. If we had a pigeon in a chamber, it would be a disc peck. Pigeon would peck the disc with its beak. So we have a very specific behavior that must occur at the end of the interval that will be reinforced.
So it's not any response?
It's not anything. It's a very specific, concrete behavior. Okay? So let's work this in reverse. I call in sick on the last day of the month. Does that mean I'd get paid?
Yes.
Sure. I don't have to go to work. I can call in sick. Is that the correct response? It's not a teaching response, is it?
There's no response.
Well, I called in sick.
Well, I mean, there's like no response to like getting the reinforcer.
The reinforcer is coming non-contingently. There's not a specific response that's producing that reinforcer. That's why the paycheck example doesn't work.
So are you saying like for the whole entire month you have to be doing something and then it happens
For which?
for the reinforcer to happen?
On an FI schedule, how many responses are required to fulfill the schedule requirement? One of the Duffies.
One.
One response is required on an FI schedule. One. When does the reinforcer occur on an FI schedule?
After a fixed number.
It's the first response that occurs after the end of the interval. One response fulfills the schedule requirement. Okay? So, okay, here's a real FI schedule. You're watching Seinfeld. You can even pick that up on YouTube. Commercial comes on and you switch channels to Jerry Springer. You know, terrible show, but go ahead and watch it. Okay? And then you switch back to see if Seinfeld is on. Then you switch back to Springfield. Or Springer, rather. Springfield. Jerry Springfield. You turn back to the Seinfeld channel more frequently when it gets closer to the end of the commercial interval. So that switching behavior is going to be reinforced. The first response that occurs after the end of the commercial will be reinforced by the opportunity to watch Jerry. That would be an FI schedule. Is there a clock that tells you when the commercial is over?
No.
Is there a timer? Is there a calendar? Then this is a real FI example. Let's talk about superstition. Superstitious behavior is when a person or an organism behaves as if the behavior is producing the reinforcer. Superstitious behavior. A person or an organism behaves as if the behavior is producing the reinforcer. Skinner did an experiment with pigeons. The feeder box was there every 15 seconds, meaning that the grain came out in the little food hopper every 15 seconds, regardless of what the bird did. In other words, the food was presented non-contingently. And what happened is that these birds developed superstitious behavior. They began to behave in ways as if that behavior produced the reinforcer. Superstitious behavior. Athletes. I should ask this question of my student who's also an athlete. Athletes engage in lots of superstitious behavior. You know any athletes? Okay. Have they talked to you about their superstitious behavior?
No, I'm the athlete.
Like never showering
Oh my god. I used to
because they won the game, and that day they didn't shower and they won the game, so I'm not going to shower because we won.
Yeah.
Does showering have anything to do with winning?
Nope.
Absolutely not. Baseball players won't change their socks. Why?
Oh, I do that.
Pardon?
I do that for soccer.
Yep.
So you're an athlete then?
I only play with like one pair of socks.
Is it for
Ever? So you never wash your socks?
Oh, I wash them. I just only wear those socks.
Because
We win when I wear those socks.
what are we talking about?
Soccer.
Well, we're talking about superstitious behavior here, aren't we? Okay?
Could you describe religion as superstitious behavior?
Religion is more likely rule-governed behavior as opposed to superstitious behavior. We talked about that in advanced classes. So, going back to superstitious behavior in the pigeon, it produced stereotype behavior. It would turn a particular way because as it turned on one occasion, the reinforcer was presented. So that behavior of turning was strengthened, more likely to occur in the future, like wearing a pair of socks and he won the soccer game. Wearing those socks had nothing to do with producing the win, but now he wears one pair of socks. So here's our fixed time schedule, as we were talking about. The reinforcer is delivered after the passage of time, independent of the response. This is a fixed time schedule. The reinforcer is delivered after the passage of time, independent of the response. Abbreviated as an FT schedule. There's our superstitious behavior. VI schedule. We talked about a VR schedule the other day. The same interpretation applies, except for we're talking about an interval now, which means a unit of time. V means varying. I means interval of time. So the reinforcer is going to be presented after the first response, after a varying interval of time. So the first interval might be 10 seconds. First response after 10 seconds will be reinforced. Then the counter resets to 0. And the next interval might be 8 seconds. First response after 8 seconds is reinforced. Counter resets to 0. The next interval may be, let's pick 17 seconds. Now it's the first response after 17 seconds that's reinforced. So we've got a varying duration of the interval. And the first response that occurs after that interval will be reinforced. A VI schedule. Oops, there we go. The reinforcer becomes available after the passage of time, but a response must be made. On a VI schedule, the reinforcer comes about after the passage of time, but a response must be made. And again, this is a very specific response. It's like the lever press, the key peck, button press, what have you. Oops, there we are. Here's our pattern of response. A VI schedule produces a moderate rate of responding with no pauses. A moderate, steady rate of responding with no pauses. You just keep chugging along. This is what it looks like right there. If we compared the VR to the VI, that's coming up in another slide here. We'll see all four schedules. We'd see that the VR pattern of response is much higher. It's much steeper. More behavior is being produced. All right, so these are the four classic schedules that we've discussed. Fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. And then we can package them in different ways. We talked about resistance to extinction. VI schedules are intermittent. A fixed interval schedule falls under that intermittent category too. So a fixed interval and a variable interval schedule will produce behavior that's more resistant to extinction. Just like the FR and the VR, they were more resistant to extinction compared to a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Quick review. This is the number of responses or the amount of time before the behavior extinguishes. This is resistance. Number of responses or amount of time before the behavior extinguishes. Any questions about either VI or FI schedules? Fixed interval, variable interval. Okay, let's do an example. You tell me. A term paper. How many people have been assigned a term paper? Is that on a FI schedule, a VI schedule, or an FT schedule? Can't quite hear you. FT, fixed time. The reinforcer comes non-contingently. Do you get an A regardless of the behavior that you produce? No. Is it on a fixed interval schedule? Why? Can't hear you. Can't.
It is going to be due regardless of if you write it or not.
So there's a deadline. On a term paper, there's a deadline. If we have a deadline, then it's not a fixed interval schedule. What else makes it not on a fixed interval schedule?
The response doesn't occur after a certain period of time. Or well, the response doesn't occur after you do the thing. Like you do the thing.
I think you're correct. We just want to say it backwards. On a term paper, you start writing early. Well, let's think about this. If you start writing early, will you get a bigger reinforcer? Meaning a better grade.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah, if you know how to write. Okay? So early responses in the interval are going to lead to a bigger reinforcer. Term paper, does it require one response? You write one word after the end of the interval?
No.
No, it requires a lot of words. Okay? So that's why term paper is not an example of an FI schedule. Any questions? Okay? Quiz time.
Video time.
Video time.